So now that we've looked at and talked a little bit about the transition from archaic Greece into classical Greece, let's take a look at the city of Athens, particularly during this time period during the reign of Pericles. Pericles was an extremely important statesman who helped unify Athens, and through a little bit of shady dealing economically was able to bring a great deal of money and funds into a rebuilding project at this place, the Acropolis in Athens. The Acropolis is a large stony plateau in the middle of the city of Athens. And in ancient times, the Acropolis, as it was called, was the center of worship and housed many great temples to the different gods and goddesses. What Pericles did during his reign, and your book will fill in some of the details, but what he did is he was able to initiate large-scale rebuilding projects on the Acropolis to basically renovate and rebuild a lot of the structures that were already there. So in this model, we get an idea of what it may have looked like when it was newly renovated. So you would see there was a grand staircase, a very, very large staircase, going up the side of the plateau, where you would enter in through the Propylaea, and then you would eventually work your way back through the complex to the Temple of Athena Nike, the Parthenon, there in the back. Although we tend to talk about the Acropolis, we always focus on the Parthenon, which we'll be doing here in a moment. It is important to remember that this was a very, very large area that had many temples and many areas of dedication to different gods and goddesses. The city of Athens, as you might imagine from its name, was dedicated to the goddess Athena. And so the major complex, the biggest and most important temple on the Acropolis was the Parthenon, the temple to Athena, which we'll take a look at. The Parthenon, the building itself, was dedicated in the year 437 BCE. About this time, the entire city of Athens had a population of about 150,000, which is pretty considerable for this era and this time period. By point of comparison, IPFW is here in the city of Fort Wayne, Indiana. We right now, as of 2014, have a population in the neighborhood of about 250,000, give or take. So Athens, ancient Athens, smaller in population, also quite a bit smaller in area than a modern day city. But it gives you an idea maybe of what kind of population, the amount of people we're talking about here. So this is the Parthenon, the temple of Athena Parthenos. We're taking a view here from the northwest, and it's the major sort of focal point of the Acropolis in Athens. Completed somewhere about 447 to 438 BCE. This is a great example of classical Doric architecture. As you look at the columns, the capitals of the columns will indicate to us that this is a Doric piece. It's supporting up a very large frieze. It again would have originally had a pitched roof with triangular pediments. There would have been statues in the pediments. The interior, we would have had a cella, just like we've noticed in other temples. So many of the same constituent parts that we would see in other temples. Let's take a look at the floor plan for this piece. So this image gives us an idea of the layout of the Parthenon originally. We're also seeing where a lot of the images, the statues used to be, and what the subject matter of those statues were. So we see, like the other Doric temple we looked at, we have a colonnade that goes all the way around the outside. Then we have an interior cella, with a naos, inside of which would have held our statue of Athena Parthenos. And we believe the Parthenon is probably named after the statue, Athena Parthenos. Let me give you some idea of how big this building was. Well, still is. Most of it's still there. At the base, so around where you see the the exterior colonnade. It's approximately 228 feet long by 101 feet wide at that base. The cella itself is 98 feet long and 63 feet wide. It's immense. Those Doric columns that wrap all the way around the outside of the building are 6.2 feet in diameter. All right, they're 34 feet tall, but they're over 6 feet just in diameter. Just picture that in your head for a moment, how massive these columns are, how incredibly immense this entire building is. And we had so much artwork on this building and in this building, in the pediments and all of the friezes. There was an interior procession, a series of images, and then there were exterior ones. As you can see, we have the Battle of the Centaurs, we have processions, we have the Sack of Troy, all of these things being depicted here. The entire purpose of the Parthenon is, of course, to be a temple to the goddess Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. More so, though, it's really a way to glorify the city of Athens, to put it on the map as the center of Greek culture. And Pericles is able to do this with funds that he got from a political organization known as the Delian League. When I mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier, there was some rather shady dealings that Pericles was involved in to get the funds necessary to create the Parthenon and to do all of the things that we see here at the Acropolis. This is not winning Athens many friends amongst the Greeks, amongst the other Greek city-states, and this will cause some tension amongst the Greek city-states. Now, what it does do for Athens, it gives them this beautiful structure, this gorgeous temple for the goddess Athena, and it really does put Athens on the map as this cultural center of ancient Greece. This becomes, if we want to use modern terminology, a type of tourist attraction during the ancient world. In the ancient times, people come from all over the known world to come see this magnificent building and to come see the statue of Athena inside of it. And we can take a look at a reconstruction of that. This is a recreation of the statue of Athena Parthenos, which would have been located in the cella of the Parthenon, in the center chamber of the Parthenon. The original statue was made of ivory and gold. So her skin there, you see, would have been real ivory, and then her robes, her crown, everything else that you see here would have been encased in gold. Wrap your head around that for a moment. The amount of material, the tonnage that would have been required to create something on this scale. She was approximately 38 feet tall. Again, it's almost hard to fathom what this would have looked like in person. Now, we do think that this is a pretty accurate reconstruction. The original statue is no longer there. It was destroyed centuries and centuries ago. But we do have a lot of written records, written descriptions. We also have something that does survive are many, many small miniatures of the Athena Parthenos that were essentially, and when I said that the Parthenon was something like an ancient tourist attraction, that wasn't really a joke. People would come to Athens to come see this magnificent temple, to come see this magnificent statue. And a bit like what tourists today do, they would want to take a little trinket home with them. So if you go to Paris, France today in the 21st century, and you want to take a little bit of a trinket home with you from your trip to Paris, what do? Well, you might buy a little replica of the Eiffel Tower and take that home with you. That's a pretty common thing to do when you're a tourist. people did that in ancient times. They had small replicas, little miniatures of Athena Parthenos that you could buy on site and take home with you to show people back in your home country, look, this is what I saw, except she was 40 feet tall. So we do have some of those, which I think is just an amazing story. And again, it reminds us that these ancient peoples were a lot more like us than we sometimes think. So she's an amazing piece. It's an amazing work of art. It is kind of a shame that she's no longer with us intact, but we do think this is a fairly accurate representation of what she would have looked like. So I spoke a little bit about Pericles, and he's getting funds from the Delian League, not entirely legally, to renovate Athens, and this is causing some tension in the region, to be sure. And this is what the money is going to. This is a lot of gold, this is a lot of ivory, and this is a lot of manpower. This is a lot of craftsmanship that's going into the entire Acropolis, let alone just this piece. So again, not winning Athens a lot of friends amongst their fellow Greek city-states, to be sure, but a magnificent piece nonetheless. The Parthenon remained in fairly good condition over the centuries until about the 17th century, when we'll get some conflicts in the region, will begin to take its toll on the piece. Your book will cover a little bit of that history. I won't go through it all here. The Parthenon, when it was originally built, of course, was a temple to the goddess Athena, so it was used for worship of Athena. Many centuries later, this would actually be converted into a Christian church and used as a Christian place of worship. It then would fall into disrepair and be unused and abused, sort of mistreated over the centuries until it would eventually fall into a great deal of disrepair, unfortunately. During the process of that, and by the time we get to the 19th century, we'll see a lot of archaeologists and explorers and whatnot will come in, begin excavating the area, see some of the great statues and works of art that are still at the Parthenon, and begin moving them away from the Parthenon, which is an issue we'll have to address in our next slide. So we're going to take a look at some of the statues that were originally on the pediments of the Parthenon. They are no longer located there. They are now currently in the British Museum in London. Now what happened was, in the 19th century, a British lord by the name of Elgin, I believe, went to Greece and negotiated a contract with the government at the time. Now Greece at that time, in the 19th century, was part of the Ottoman Empire. So it was the local Ottoman Sultan who was in charge of Greece, and with whom Elgin reached an arrangement to remove the major statues that were left at the Parthenon and take them to London. And he paid the Sultan a decent amount of money. I couldn't say what that was in modern day dollars, but he paid for them, he reached this agreement, and the statues that were still at the Parthenon, now at that point some had already been destroyed, had been lost, for a variety of different reasons. When I mentioned that the Parthenon was briefly made into a Christian church, a Christian house of worship. The Christians removed a lot of the pieces because they didn't want pagan imagery in a Christian church. But whatever was left, Elgin had access to, and he took most of it down and he shipped it off to London. Now, the London Museum has reconstructed spaces within their quite large museum so that people can see these things and have access to them. Now, I want to bring up this issue of where these are located for a couple different reasons. One, it's going to influence how we, the viewers, can relate to these pieces, because we can no longer see them in their original architectural context. Now they're just on these pedestals, on these displays in a museum space, and they look far different. They're under controlled lighting as opposed to being in the sunlight of the Mediterranean. And while certainly we can go back and forth and say, well, it's better for them to be here or it's better for them to be there, just just the practicality of it is, when we look at pictures of these in the London Museum, this is a completely different context for these images. We are not seeing them the way the artist wanted us to see them. They are not a part of the overall scheme of the Parthenon, with all of its other decoration, with all of its other sculptures, with its framing of the architecture itself. And when it is important for us as art scholars to keep that in mind when we see these pieces. We're missing a big part of the story when we're seeing them out of context here. Now, there's a political controversy that goes along with these pieces. Certainly the Greek government in more recent times, since it is now no longer a part of the Ottoman Empire, more recently the Greek government has petitioned England to try to get these statues back, or at least some of them back. And the British Museum is pretty adamant that that's not going to happen. There's an ethical issue here that perhaps I'll have you address in our discussion board online, but I want to make you aware of it. Both the artistic implications and the political implications of what we're seeing with these pieces. Now I'm going to leave that aside for a moment and talk about these pieces stylistically. Now your book goes to great length to describe the story here of Helios and Dionysus and the entire mythological story being told. So I'm not going to repeat that. Hopefully you've had a chance to read your book and you know the story that's being told. So we'll just look at it in terms of this being a classical piece and look at it stylistically. I especially want to pay attention to Dionysus, maybe Heracles, but we'll call him Dionysus, here on the right-hand side of this image. That particular section of this piece is about 4'3". He's carved out of marble, and we're seeing that wonderful attention again to musculature and detail, even right down to the drapery we see on his side. It's a little overdone, a little bit overemphasized, which we might expect from this period of the classical era, but also, again, that context, that architectural context. Keep in mind this was a pediment statue. This would have been up, extremely high up, probably about 70 feet in the air, in the pediment, in that triangular pediment at the top of this building. So as close as you could possibly be is directly underneath it, 70 feet away. And to be honest, to actually see this thing, you're going to have to be farther away from the front of the building. So you're going to be a good 100 feet away from this to actually see it. So when we see these figures, the way they're turned, the way some of the musculature is overemphasized, how the gestures might be, we also need to keep in mind that you would have originally seen these statues 100 feet away, way up at the top of this building. The artists who created these knew that and expected that and would have adjusted their design accordingly. So that's a little bit of the context that is lost to us because of how these are being presented now, that we just kind of have to use our imagination to fill in the blanks. So we're seeing a little bit of that here with Dionysus. We'll see some other uniquely classical elements here in this next piece. Also from this pediment on the Parthenon are these three goddesses, and we've sort of hesitantly named them here. That's our best guess of who these goddesses are, you can see in the title. So also from the east pediment, the tallest one in this arrangement is about 4'5", made out of marble again. And what I'll point out to you here, again without going into the mythology that your book talks about, is the style, because this is displaying a characteristic classical technique that is especially often used with female figures. Again, we're seeing a lot of male figures, god figures, being represented nude, like we saw with Dionysus. These female figures, these goddesses, are clothed. There's still a desire, however, to show the natural form of their bodies, and how their bodies are shaped underneath their clothing. So they've created a technique that we call wet drapery, which means very much what it sounds like. They're sculpting the clothing almost like it's wet cloth and it's clinging to the skin of the body, so that we can show that the body is clothed, that it's covered up, but at the same time we can still see the breasts, the hips, the legs, and all of that attention to detail. It's a bit of a compromise, you might want to say it that way. So I do want to talk a little bit more about this interesting dichotomy of male bodies and female bodies, and we may best be able to get into that with our next statue. So the sculptor Praxiteles gives us this image of Aphrodite from the city of Knidos. She's carved out of marble. This is a Roman copy. The original Greek was probably bronze, but she's 6'8", so pretty substantial. And she's a rare example of a female figure that's completely nude. Now she is a goddess, and more importantly, she's Aphrodite, the goddess of love and sexuality. She is almost the only time you're going to see a nude female figure of this scale and of this magnitude, is when it is actually Aphrodite, the goddess of love. We feel in ancient Greece that we can sort of get away with it with her. Now, why this odd dichotomy? Why are female figures, even Athena, always represented clothed, while male figures are almost always nude? It has a lot to do with the Greek conception of perfection and their relationship to the gods and goddesses. Men and women in ancient Greece were not treated equally by any means. It was a very male-dominated society, a highly patriarchal society. Women, for the most part, and I do want to note, there are exceptions to every rule, and there are a few exceptions in ancient Greece as well. But for the most part, if I can speak generally, women were not afforded the same rights or opportunities, and were not at all seen as the equals of men in most ancient Greek city-states. The reason for that, one of the many reasons, I should say, for that, is because of this concept of man's relationship to the gods and goddesses. A part of Greek religious philosophy is that the gods can take human form, and they can take human form because they can manifest themselves in perfect form. So, to try to explain this a little bit further, ancient Greek religion and ancient Greek philosophy has this idea that there is such a thing as a hierarchy of forms, and when it comes to the human body, there are two basic types of human bodies. There are male bodies and there are female bodies. In the hierarchy of forms, the male human body is the most perfect human body. It is more perfect and therefore more beautiful and therefore more pleasing to the gods than the female human body. The female body is of course necessary, but it is not considered the equal to the male body. We are more likely to see representations of a nude male figure in ancient Greek art because they simply felt that the male body was the apex of human perfection. If you want to talk about the perfect human body, you are always talking about the male body in ancient Greece. Female bodies were less perfect because they were not male. They tended to be covered up because they are less perfect, and because women in the society tended to be highly sequestered and women were typically not allowed to participate in public the way that men were. And so we see this interesting body politics that I mentioned in our first part with the Critios boy, wrapped up in these representations. So one of the rare exceptions, of course, is Aphrodite, this female goddess of love and sexuality. And here we see her in the nude. She's just taken off her robe. She's about to bathe. She's about to take a bath. And we'll notice the position of her body. She's still being represented with that contrapposto, the shifting of the weight. So we're representing her in a naturalistic way to show her as a realistic body. And there is a certain element of sexuality to her, and you can see it clearly in her representation. She has taken off her robe to expose her body, As we follow the line of her leg and the line of her arm, on the arm on our left, you'll notice the way it comes down around in front of her to sort of bring our eye to her genitals. That's not an accident. That's an element of titillation and sexuality. Praxiteles here wants to make it clear that this is the goddess of love, the goddess of sexuality, and he's going to put those elements in here. But this is an odd situation. You would not see Athena portrayed in this way. You would not see Hera portrayed in this way. Aphrodite is about the one example of a goddess, a female figure, that we're going to see in this light. Because usually nudity is reserved for the male form. And so we see that here. Here's Praxiteles again. And this is Hermes, the god Hermes, with the infant Dionysus. So we see Hermes is also nude, completely nude. He has no pretense of having taken off his robe for a bath. There's no narrative reason why he should be nude. It's just understood that he is a male god and therefore has the perfect representation of the human body. And so, of course, we're going to display it nude. We're going to display it in all of its beauty and perfection. And here he's cradling the infant god Dionysus. We can see that the statue has been broken in a couple places, so it's not complete. We think that originally, in his outstretched hand on our left that is broken, he was probably holding a bunch of grapes. And we think that because this is the baby Dionysus, and Dionysus was the god of wine and is usually associated with grapes. So we're just sort of filling in the pieces there. As we look at Hermes, the representation here, he's nude, of course. He's highly muscled. We can see a great deal of attenuation in the muscles. Great use of contrapposto. That S-curve of the body. Really fantastic representation of how the spine leans one way while the leg underneath him moves back. You can see there's really fantastic detail in the legs, in the feet. You can actually see some of the veins underneath his skin. So artists have really dialed in these details to make these statues absolutely breathe with all of these details. Now what we're going to notice, we're still going to consider this a classical era piece. But what we're going to notice, though, is a transition from this era into what we call the Hellenistic. Now, we've already discussed how in the classical era, we begin with a certain level of naturalism and realism, and then almost immediately move into these exaggerated representations, where the musculature and the bodies are just a little too perfect. They're sort of hyper-attenuated, without being abstract. Now we're going to see that being taken in a slightly different direction during the Hellenistic era. So think of these classical statues that we've been looking at, where the bodies are highly refined, muscled. There is an abstraction to them. They are slightly exaggerated, but they still have the appearance of being somewhat real. We can still identify them as realistic bodies, even if they are subtly distorted. Now let's look at this guy, Weary Heracles, by the artist Lysippos, dating from about 320 BCE. He's quite large. He's over 10 feet high. This is another Roman copy, but as far as we can tell, it's going to be fairly accurate to the original. This is a good example of this transition to the Hellenistic. Now this is Heracles, so the great hero, Heracles. Some of you listening to this may know him as Hercules. Hercules is not the correct pronunciation. He's a Greek god, so he's related to Hera, so he's Heracles. And yes, that is a nitpick, but, you know, this is a college class. We'll say it the right way. So we see Heracles. He's weary. He's leaning against this post. He looks like he's just taking a breath, like he's trying to relax. And just look at that torso. Look at those arms. He's just super overdeveloped in musculature. And we can always sort of shrug that off and say, well, he's Heracles. He's like supposed to be the strongest man in the world. But if we look at some other representations of Heracles, like some that you see in your book, you'll notice that he hasn't always been represented that way. He always had this sort of supernatural super strength, but he wasn't usually represented with great big huge muscles. This we'll see in the Hellenistic period, this much later time period in Greek culture, we'll start to see this exaggeration really goes forward in a pretty amazing way. Now, we still have all of the same attention to realistic detail that we saw in the classical. You can see the tendons on his legs and his feet, his fingernails, fantastic texture in the beard and the hair. We're not sacrificing detail at all, but we are going to sort of overemphasize that musculature, over-attenuate the body. Now, I have another view of Heracles from the other side. This is the backside of Heracles, where we can see that over attenuation and musculature continues all the way around the piece. In his hand on his back here, you can see he's holding some of the golden apples from one of his many labors, which, I won't go into all of those stories today. But keep this in mind, because this sort of exaggeration will be a key characteristic of the Hellenistic, and also the mood or attitude of this piece. This isn't Heracles triumphant. This isn't Heracles locked in combat. This is Heracles in a very quiet, reflective moment, almost a somber moment. And it's that sort of attitude that is also going to be characteristic of Hellenistic pieces. So we're talking about this transition from the late classical into the Hellenistic, which we touched on with Heracles previously, to try to give us a sense of where we are in the timeline. So the classical period ends with Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great, as you read in your book, really helped transform the Mediterranean world politically and begins to usher in a whole new age of art. The Hellenistic age begins with the death of Alexander until the death of Cleopatra. So we've already talked about ancient Egypt and the decline of the cultural influence of Egypt in the Mediterranean world. By the time we get to Cleopatra, she is sort of the last major ruler of Egypt in that Egyptian tradition. When she dies, Egypt is able to become a province in the Roman Empire. Now, we haven't started talking about Rome yet, obviously. We'll be getting to them next week and the week after. We'll start looking at the ancient traditions of Italy and how that will develop into Rome. But here in Greece, we'll see that after Egypt becomes a province within the Roman Empire, this is going to spur a new era of expansion of Roman influence, which will eventually begin to absorb a lot of Greece as well. The Romans have an interest in ancient Greece from the very beginning. There's a very close relationship to the Romans and to the Greeks. And that's why we'll see a lot of parallels in their arts and a lot of places where it looks like the Romans are just sort of copying wholesale from the Greeks. There's a great deal of respect from the Romans towards the Greeks. In art, in the Hellenistic period of Greek culture, both architects and sculptors will begin to break a lot of these rules of classical design. Now, here's what's happening in ancient Greece during this time period, and during the time period of that this temple here, this altar of Zeus in Pergamon is being built. Not only do we see the cultural decline of previously great empires like Egypt, which Greece had a lot of contact with, we see the rise of Rome during the same time period. Also, Greece is experiencing many, many invasions from northern tribes, northern European tribes coming into Greek areas, into Greek city-states in these invasions. Now, the Greeks refer to all of these peoples, no matter what their ethnicity is, they refer to them as barbarians. Barbarian comes from a Greek word. Our English word comes from the Greek. And barbarian in ancient Greek times referred to anybody of any culture who didn't speak Greek. If you didn't speak Greek, you were a barbarian. And it's kind of a funny story that the Greeks would say anyone who didn't speak Greek just sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar. It was just gibberish. And so they were just all barbarians, uncivilized people who didn't speak Greek. It gives you a sense of some of the cultural chauvinism and some of the superiority that Greeks may have felt towards other peoples and other languages. But the reason that this is important is that all of these influences, the collapse of previous empires, opens up a power vacuum in the Mediterranean. We're seeing that Athens and these other city-states that had an elevated status within the Greek mainland, they begin to experience a cultural and economic decline as well. Then we have these foreign invaders, these Gauls and other ethnic groups from Europe coming down into Greece. We have the Romans rising in power and sophistication. All of this throws Greek culture into a bit of a tumult, where we're going to see the art, the architecture, everything changes because culture itself is changing radically. With all of these different influences coming in, people are beginning to doubt and not want to maintain their classical traditions, and that's what's going to sweep us into the Hellenistic period. So we'll see Hellenistic sculptors are going to embrace new subject matter. We see already in this temple here that we're looking at on the screen, radical new designs and architecture. This is so not a classical temple. I mean, it's a completely different shape. It's a completely different design. We're going to see the treatment of classical subject matter or traditional subject matter in a new way. Like I'll show you here in just a second. New subject matters being brought in, Gallic chiefs and so on. A little bit more violent content coming into the scene. All of this is a reaction to the cultural and political instability of the time. As any culture destabilizes, politically, economically, socially, the art will reflect that chaos, will reflect that instability. Greece is no exception to that. And in fact, you see it, and we will in this class see it again and again and again. Whenever there's a radical change to culture, the art will reflect the chaos of that time. So let's pay a little bit more attention to that with this piece by taking a look at a particular section of the frieze from this temple. And by the way, the frieze on this temple is not up on the roof where it was in the classical temples. As you can see, it's down along the bottom, along the base. So just this entire altar to Zeus is a completely different construction model than anything we've seen before. So this is a scene from that altar. This is Athena battling some of the giants, which is the story being told in this frieze. It's quite a substantial piece made out of marble. It's 7.5 feet tall, so quite substantial. Obviously we have some damage here, some pieces that have broken off, but we'll just take the whole thing as we see it. So there's Athena. She is right in the center there. And she's battling these otherworldly creatures with their wings, and we see serpents and giants. First of all, it's a very violent scene, which we haven't seen before. We've seen people preparing for war. We've seen people sort of posing after war. We haven't seen a lot of representations of people actively engaged in war, with maybe a couple of exceptions on some vases that we looked at earlier. Here is the goddess Athena, wrapped up in this battle. She's fully clothed, a little bit of that wet drapery going on there, so we see that tradition continue. But we'll want to pay attention to the overall composition, how chaotic the composition is, how she's grabbed this one figure by the hair, their arms and legs are flailing about in a very dramatic fashion. I do love the wings on these creatures. They're really beautifully done. These wonderful snakes, these serpents coming up out of the background. We're going to see a lot more emotional content and much more drama in these scenes. So this is Athena presented in a way that we haven't seen Athena before. And that's going to be a part of this Hellenistic time period. We're going to see a couple different things. Things like this, which are images that we're familiar with presented in different ways. So Athena, a common subject matter, but presented in a much different and much more dramatic way. And then new subject matter that was not previously represented before, like we see in the next slide. This is a very dramatic piece. What we see here is a representation of a Gallic chieftain. So the Gauls were a group of what the Greeks called barbarians, generally from the area we today might consider France. And the Gauls were a large group of people who were coming in and invading into Greek territories. Here we see this graphic, violent scene of this Gallic chieftain killing himself and his wife. This is again a marble copy from the Romans, approximately 6'11". So again, a big piece. This was also found in the bronze original was from Pergamon, the same place where we saw that previous image of Athena. Let's consider what we're seeing here, just in terms of subject matter, because we do not see this in the classical era. We do not see these kinds of representations. So the Gauls are enemies of the Greeks. They're barbarians. The Greeks do not consider them to be civilized peoples. They don't even speak a sensible language as far as the Greeks are concerned. Again, it's that sort of cultural chauvinism, that sense of superiority that we find in a lot of ancient Greek culture. Here, on the surface of it, this may seem to be an image that would support that. After all, here's a guy committing suicide, killing himself. He's already killed his wife. But as we look a little bit deeper into the story, we can see that something else is happening here. First of all, Greeks typically don't represent their enemies. That's not a common thing to have happen. We see the enemies of the gods and goddesses of Olympus, but we don't see lots of representations of the enemies of the Greeks. When we do see it here in this Hellenistic period, we see it in this way. And the story that goes behind this Gallic chieftain has killed his wife and is about to kill himself. He's in the process of it, and I don't know how well you guys can see it in the slide. He's driving the point of his short sword here into his collarbone. And if you can get a good look, and I have a close-up of this, you'll see it a little bit better, where the blade has sunk into his flesh, the sculptor has actually sculpted some of the blood coming down his chest. I hope you'll see it a little bit better in the next slide, I think. But he's in this violent act. The reason he's doing this, the reason he has killed his wife and is killing himself, is because he has been defeated by the Greeks. He is a soldier. He's in a conflict with the Greek military. He's about to lose. He doesn't want to be taken captive. He doesn't want to be made a slave. And so he's going to kill himself and kill his family rather than be taken prisoner. Now, to our modern ears, this sounds incredibly harsh and brutal. Now, to the Greeks, however, this was an incredibly admirable and honorable thing to do. The Greeks very much, particularly in some city-states, like ancient Sparta, for example, this idea of death before dishonor was an extremely important part of the culture. This idea that I would rather take my life than become a prisoner of my enemy was considered an incredibly noble and honorable ideal. So if we apply that here to this Gallic chieftain who has killed himself and his wife, is in the process of doing that, what we're seeing is that in this Hellenistic period, not only are we representing enemies of the Greeks, we're representing them as noble heroes, heroic figures who are honorable, who are respectable, who are perhaps even worthy enemies to our soldiers. That's a real radical concept, and it's certainly not something that we saw in ancient Egyptian art. It's not something we saw with the Assyrians or the Akkadians or any of these other cultures that we've been looking at previously. It's very unique to this time period. Let's take a close-up at this guy. So this is significant. We are presenting an enemy as being just as honorable and noble as any Greek hero ever was. This is perhaps in response to, again, generally speaking, the Greeks in most of these places are not winning these battles by and large. Their period of dominance is quickly coming to an end. These barbarian forces are coming into the area. The Romans are starting to take over in some of these areas. The Greeks sort of see the writing on the wall, as it were, that their culture is in decline. And that's where we start to see these differences in artistic styles. And perhaps this idea of our enemy being noble, being honorable, this somehow takes the sting out of all of these losses. I mean, after all, it's maybe not such a bad thing to lose to an honorable, respectable enemy, as opposed to just losing to a barbarian, to an uncivilized group of people. So that may be a bit of the psychological negotiation that we see going on with images like this. Now, this piece was not displayed on its own. It was a part of a group. Now, let's take a look at that another image from the group. So this is also a part of that group. This is another dying Gaul. This Gaul has already been stricken in battle. We can just barely see the wound on his side. He's dying on the ground here. He's also represented in the nude, as we would expect a male figure in this Greek tradition to be done. But we see that he has the haircut, the mustache, and this collar around his neck. That all identifies him as a Gaul. That was pretty typical of how we would identify a Gaul at this period. Again, just a gorgeous piece. I won't point out all the details. It would be easy to obsess and to do that. This particular man was a trumpeter. We can see his horn on the ground. He's dropped it next to him. And we see him very nobly, very honorably, sort of suffering through his death. But, he's not going to be taken captive. He's not going to submit to his enemy. He's going to die this honorable death. And that's certainly how the Greeks of the time period would have read this. Again, the details are beautiful. Look at the feet, the details on the feet, the hands, the arms. You can really get a sense of flesh over muscle and vein. It's all there. All of those classical elements that we've noticed before are there, but they're being applied to a radically different subject matter with a very different kind of subtext to them. And that's characteristic of this Hellenistic period. It's a different kind of artwork telling a different kind of story. So your textbook will go on to describe the Nike of Samothrace, the Barberini faun, the seated boxer, and a few other examples of these unusual subject matter or unusual treatments of traditional subject matter. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on this piece, Laocoon and His Sons, done from about the 1st century CE, carved out of marble. This replica is, and it's over 7 feet tall, and it's quite an amazing piece. And I'm going to focus on this one because I think the story of Laocoon is a wonderful metaphor for Hellenistic Greece. And for that attitude shift that I mentioned in the artwork of this time period. First, let's just look at it stylistically and try to negotiate what we're looking at. So here's Laocoon. He's the center figure, and he's the main player in our story. And I'll tell you a little bit about the story here in a second. We see that he is being wrapped up by these large snakes, and that those snakes also entwine 2 smaller figures on either side of him. Those are Laocoon's sons. Now, the sons look a little bit different from Laocoon. It's a little bit awkward. Those may be later additions to this piece. Those may not be original, what the original would have looked like. So we'll just have to leave that aside for now. There may be an inconsistency there. What's important for the story is to realize that that's our main character, Laocoon. He is being eaten, torn apart by large snakes. He is twisting and writhing in agony. And it's a really dramatic, violent scene as he and his sons get eaten up. The story of Laocoon comes from the story of the Trojan War. So again, the Trojan War is a major part of Greek art and Greek identity. We see representations of these battles and these heroes throughout Greek culture. Laocoon is not an epic hero. He's not like Achilles or Ajax. He's not Agamemnon. He's not any one of these fantastic heroes from Greek legend. Laocoon is a seer. So he's somebody who has the ability to predict the future or see things in advance, and he lives in the city of Troy. So during the Trojan War, and if you're at all familiar with the story of the Trojan War, you've probably heard of the story of the Trojan horse. What happened was, there was a prolonged battle between the Greeks and the Trojans, where the Greeks were trying to siege the city of Troy, but just were not getting anywhere. They could not seem to break through the defenses. So they came up with a plan. They left a large wooden horse, they constructed it and left it outside the gates of Troy, and then they had their ships sail away out of the bay. So the people of Troy saw this massive horse outside their gates, and then they looked out into the harbor and saw that the Greek ships were leaving. They thought that the Greeks had given up, and that they were acknowledging how magnificent the Trojans were by giving them this big tribute in the form of this horse. So they were going to open the gates and bring the horse in and celebrate. Laocoon, he comes up and says, no, 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 we can't do that. Don't do that. It's a trap. It's a trick. We can't bring this horse into the city. Beware of Greeks bringing gifts. And that's a sort of an old cliche saying now, but this comes from Laocoon. And so the people are confused. They're like, okay, well, Laocoon is our seer, and he's telling us not to take this gift, so maybe we shouldn't. So Laocoon, keep this in mind, he's doing exactly what he should. He's been blessed by the gods with sight, with being a seer. He's expected to use that talent of his to help his people and help his city of Troy. And that's exactly what he's doing. Because if you know this story, you know that inside that horse are actually an entire group of heavily armed Greek soldiers who are just waiting to ambush the Trojans and overthrow the city from the inside. Because the Greek ships have not gone home to Greece. They're just sort of out of the way hiding and are going to come back after sundown. So this is a trick. This is in fact a trick that the Greeks are playing on the Trojans. Now when Laocoon warns the Trojans and they hesitate, the gods and goddesses, especially Athena, they want the Greeks to succeed. They're on the Greeks' side in this war. And so they need to do something. They see that Laocoon is warning the Trojans, so they feel like they have to do something to discredit them. So they send a group of big snakes into the city of Troy, and the snakes they eat Laocoon and his sons in a grisly, gruesome scene. They just devour these people alive. The other Trojans see what's happening to Laocoon and his sons and think, oh, wow, the gods really don't like Laocoon. Maybe we should not take his advice. This is a sign from the gods that we should not take the advice of Laocoon. So let's bring that horse in and celebrate our victory over the Greeks. So they do. And if you know the story, you know how it ends. The Trojans bring the horse in, they have a great big party. In the middle of the night, once the party's died down, the Greeks come out of the horse, they begin killing the guards, they overthrow the city, the other Greeks from outside come in, and that's eventually how the Greeks are able to win the Trojan War and break the city of Troy. It's a great story. And it's captured really well in this piece, where we see this over-attenuation of musculature, we see this overly dramatic and violent scene, the look of agony on Laocoon's face as he's wrestling with these snakes, and they're devouring him and biting him and wrapping up his sons. It's just an incredibly dramatic scene and powerful scene. But I think, moreover, the reason that we're seeing it represented here has a lot to do with perhaps a Greek cultural sense of helplessness during this time period, during this Hellenistic time period. Because think about it. Laocoon was doing everything right. He was doing everything his culture wanted of him, everything his culture expected of him, everything the gods apparently wanted him to do. He was doing it. He did nothing wrong, and he got eaten by snakes anyway. He got punished anyway, and his city was sacked anyway. It's just such a fatalistic and pessimistic story. And it's so Hellenistic in that regard that you have to wonder, and I'm always a little hesitant to psychoanalyze ancient people, especially in such a disconnected way, but you can't help but wonder, as Greeks in general are sort of realizing that they are in the decline of their civilization as other groups are moving in. Eventually, as the Romans will start to gain more and more influence in the region, to an extent, there must be a lot of Greeks, there must be a cultural sense that they are like Laocoon. They're doing, as far as they can tell, everything right, trying to honor the gods, trying to do everything that their culture demands of them, but they're losing anyway. They're getting swallowed up anyway by these outside forces. So anyway, maybe I'm reaching a little bit with that metaphor, but I think it is a great analogy for Hellenistic Greek culture and what we see happening with the Hellenistic Greeks, which is why I like to focus on this piece. But everything about it, the story, the design, the composition, the way the body is rendered, the violence of the scene, all of those are telltale Hellenistic pieces, Hellenistic characteristics that we simply would not see in a classical representation. As we close out for this week, here are some questions that you might want to keep in mind and be thinking about as you organize your notes that might help you out in further discussion boards, writing assignments, and what have you. Be thinking about the funerary markers and stelae, and there's a lot of parallels to what we see with many of these ancient cultures to things that we still do today. Be thinking about those connections in terms of funerary customs and also beliefs about the human body, and how the body is represented and distorted. Certainly there's a lot that could be said about the Greek obsession with the ideal human body and our own contemporary culture's obsession with that same thing. Consider how Greek art changes with the conquests of Alexander the Great and later on, and then with the influence of the Persians and then the Romans. That last sort of section of Greek history, we see some pretty radical changes going on in Greek culture. So be thinking about what might attest to that and what exactly is going on there. So that is it for this week. We'll wrap up with the Greeks there. Next week, we'll move on to the Etruscans and the Romans and begin the long discussion of the Roman Empire and everything that they've done to shape the landscape of Europe and the world beyond. So, until next week, I'll talk at you later.